This is a production of Cornell University.
We'll get started again. I'm professor in the English department, and it's my great pleasure to introduce our final panel of three intensive critic minds who were here in 3 different decades and have gone in very different directions, and they all have Jonathan in common, of course. We're going to start with Eva Badowska, who got her PhD here in 1999. Their dissertation entitled Stories of Identification, Readings in 19th Century Literature and Psychoanalysis. She is currently an associate professor of English and comparative literature and is the acting dean of the Graduate School of Arts and Sciences at Fordham University. She's published on Victorian fiction, feminist theory, psychoanalytic theory, and Polish poetry. And she is working on 2 projects now on the filmmaker Kieslowski. The first is a collection she is editing entitled No End, Interdisciplinary Perspectives on Film, Ethics, and Religion in Kieslowski's Decalogue. And she's also working on a monograph, Kieslowski in Theory and History. Please welcome Eva Badowska.
I'm going to invoke Leland. I don't know where you are, Leland, but... Okay. Actually, more than once, imagine that. Like Leland, I am where I am thanks to Jonathan, but I also am where I am through no fault of his. When I received Jonathan's invitation, I went into a proper tailspin of self-doubt about what I might possibly be doing here amongst all of you. Asking, and that's a question I may never be able to address or shake, what it means to be a good enough disciple, student. Part of the problem, you see, is that I use language like that, the good enough mother, or in this case, the good enough daughter. So I've been thinking about this ever since, and not just ever since the invitation, but ever since 1992 when I came to Cornell. Thinking about the work one does as paying a tribute to one's best teacher, even if the work itself might not always instantiate the teacher's best teaching. And I hope it's possible. Jonathan, you see, is not just an adult, or even just a writer, dare I say such a thing. He's a scholar teacher for whom the pedagogical mode is the theoretical mode, and for whom teaching is writing. But today, I talk about Kieslowski's Decalogue. When the state of exception was declared in Poland in December 1981, Krzysztof Kieslowski, who was trained in the venerable tradition of Polish documentary cinema, wanted to chronicle political trials that took place under martial law. Thousands of political activists were interned in makeshift prisons before they were brought to trial, often in military courts that bypassed even the Soviet-style court system. Courts were handing out severe sentences for minor infractions, such as painting anti-communist graffiti, participating in public assemblies, leaving home without proper identification, or breaking the curfew. 6 o'clock, and no telephones. When Kieslowski actually began filming, something unexpected took place. Instead of playing the role of passive witness, the camera became an actor in the proceedings. When it was present in the courtroom, jail sentences were either not imposed at all or were suspended. The camera had this effect whether or not it was loaded with film. And the effect continued when Kieslowski began to use a second dummy camera, a token cinematic presence. So he would actually come into the courtroom, put the camera over there, and leave. This strange effect could be a reverberation of what Giorgio Agamben describes in his work on the state of exception as the original structure in which law encompasses living beings by means of its own suspension. The presence of the camera in the courtroom appeared at first to counteract the repressiveness of the regime. But in a sense, it also deepened it, as it showed how easy it is to place the legal system on which individual fates depend, in a state of exception that inevitably brings about tragic lawlessness. For Agamben, this state of exception constitutes the terrifying essence of modern statehood because it suspends, as Leland says in his book, the distinction between legality and illegality. Kieslowski's role as director is both to witness neutrally, he says that the camera is an apparatus with an extremely long memory, and to highlight critically the state of exception in front of the camera. Because he cannot film that state of exception, Kieslowski turns to states of exception in his 1988 TV series Decalogue, which was remarkably allowed to be released on the Polish state TV channel. Having initially entertained the idea of a 10-film series based around the Ten Commandments, Kieslowski eventually selected a large complex of commie blocks in Warsaw with, as he says, thousands of similar windows framed within the establishing shot as the setting of the films. In the series, the act of filming, of piercing through the concrete walls of these apartments, recasts the mundane here and now of the dwellers of these blocks with all its desolation and anomie, into the not quite local, not quite universal mode that is a hallmark of Kieslowski's cinematic work. The camera's dual role as witness and critic is particularly pronounced in the most metacritical of the 10 films, Decalogue 6, also released in a revised feature film version as a short film about love. 6 goes further than any other episode by doubling the voyeuristic gaze of the director's camera in the main character's telescopic obsession. In the television version, Tomek, a young postal worker, steals a telescope lens in order to spy on an attractive, slightly older woman, Magda, who lives in the apartment block opposite his. Tomek, a modern-day peeping Tom, has been spying on Magda for a while when the film begins. He inherited the pastime from an absent friend whose room he now occupies. There are multiple substitutions. In a way, Tomek's transgressions against privacy are exactly of the kind that make Kieslowski choose glycerin tears over real ones when he moves away from documentary films to fiction films. A film camera could not capture such offenses without committing an even greater, because public, transgression against the individual's right to self-possession. In addition to spying for a telescope, Tomek sends Magda forged money order notices, calls in emergency services to interrupt her lovemaking, steals and reads love letters addressed to her, and so on. Eventually, he confesses to her that he had been watching her, and against all odds succeeds in manipulating her into going out on a date with him. But the night ends in sexual humiliation so devastating to him that he attempts to commit suicide by cutting his wrists. This is when the point of view is reversed, and it is now Magda's turn to pick up a pair of ineffectual opera glasses to look for Tomek's return from the hospital. When he does return and she goes to see him at the post office where he works, he only tells her that he does not spy on her anymore. The passive act of witnessing is revealed to have a critical impact on both the witness and the witnessed. Divestments of privacy are very costly to all. And I'm going to show you the opening sequence of the film, and you'll see why shortly. In slow-mo, but...
Niech pani sama sprawdzi.
Do kiedy mam się?
Może jak będzie następny epizod.
The post office in the film's opening sequence is a trace representation, a shadow of the pervasive system of communist bureaucracy in which the two actors are caught, as it were, from before the beginning of the film. The system assigns them roles that inform as well as subvert their real-life roles as lover and beloved. In the post office, they are clerk and client. The first shot is a medium close-up of Magda as she approaches the post office window where Tomek serves as clerk. She steps in front of the window, and we see her from Tomek's point of view from behind a glass partition. Magda approaches the window, impatiently fanning herself with a postal notice, informing her that a money order is available to be cashed. Whenever we see Tomek from Magda's point of view, her own reflection in the glass window is superimposed on the image. In one of the frames, both of Tomek's eyes are caught in the opening as he looks Magda up and down. Magda has no expectation that this will be a real human encounter, but she's not cowed by her contact with the bureaucratic apparatus either. But something happens. He lingers on her for a few seconds too long, and his response to her one-word demand is a foreboding "nie ma," imprecisely translated in the subtitles as nothing, which, as I will later discuss, echoes through the entire film, as does this initial non-meeting. The post office scenes in 6 are defined by the presence of a window that divides the clerk from the petitioner. This partition is made of transparent glass punctured with 2 openings, a circular one above at the level of the client's face to allow for conversation, and a semicircular below at the level of the counter to facilitate the exchange of documents and money. This was, to be sure, the standard bureaucratic setup at the time, but Kieslowski's choice of the setting goes beyond the requirements of realism. In fact, he seems to be preoccupied with this particular bureaucratic setup as it reappears a number of times in his early documentaries. In fact, 6 is a film in which the pane of glass constitutes the defining visual signifier. Tomek spies on Magda through a telescope trained at her apartment's windows and meets with her at the post office, separated from her by a window pane. Both the post office window and the apartment window are marked with circular shapes that interrupt their unity. The openings have the paradoxical effect of highlighting the presence of an obstruction. These orifices, like bodily ones, mark the separation between the inside and the outside and constitute an opening towards communication and sexual encounter. Yet the film seems to be asking whether they are enough of an opening toward either, and thus whether dialogues or encounters can ever take place. In this way, the post office setting is integral to the artistic significance of the film. The film is not so much about voyeurism, that's the most boring reading of this film, as about divisions between viewer and viewed, client and clerk, lover and loved. Scenes at the post office trace a sort of arc through 6. They stand as the first, the middle, and the last scenes of the film, demarcating its formal narrative trajectory in a perfectly Aristotelian fashion. But how is the post office a fitting locus in a film that apparently focuses on personal and romantic rather than administrative and bureaucratic relationships? On the one hand, the Postal Service is a textbook allegory for the successes and breakdowns of communication, delivering and failing to deliver love letters or money orders. And I was delighted the other day while wandering late at night in Goldwyn Smith to see that the Purloined Poe was still on Jonathan's syllabus. As an image of human relationships, it demonstrates the desire to connect as much as the difficulty of connecting. On the other hand, the post office is the embodiment of specifically communist bureaucracy, which subtly permeates the characters' lives. The post office captures the complexity of human relations under communism, the historical aspect, and gestures to their opacity at any time, the metaphysical aspect. Zizek, in The Fright of Real Tears, uses the post office scene in 6 as an example of what he calls the function of interface. The visually arresting aspect of these scenes, the fact that Magda is there twice, perhaps even 3 times. She's there in the body on film, and then she's reflected in the glass pane, and she sees her own reflection reflected in the glass pane, and she sees herself reflected in Tomek's eyes. It's an echoing chamber. So for Zizek, it has a metaphysical significance, of course, as well as a psychoanalytic significance. In 6, though, the spectral reflection is part not just of any drab reality, but the richly and specifically resonant architecture of the post office. It is helpful to look at Tomek here as both the clerical subject of the post office and the amorous subject of the film's romance plot, for he's both. His intense interiority, of which his secret voyeurism is a perverse manifestation, could be seen as the not entirely unpredictable obverse of his nothingness within the bureaucratic structure of the post office. He's a clerk, rather than an individual sexual perversion. His inwardness and awkwardness can be read not as character flaws, but rather as symptoms of a social system that methodically devalues individuality and privacy. Human beings as postal clerks, we could speak perhaps of postal subjects, are alienated in the world as post office to the point that their personal desires and individual acts assume exaggerated and perverse forms. But this perversity is a social, not an individual condition. These forms may be an extreme manifestation of the intense interiority that communist bureaucracy, in its intent on producing sociability, paradoxically enforces. It is plausible to read the overtly intense atmosphere of the apartment buildings where the series takes place, the concentration, as it were, of inner drama within the walls of socialist-era commie blocks, as a realist portrayal of the heightened significance of the private life under communism. Communism, amongst other things, was a social system in which the private itself was made perverse by the meaninglessness of the social and the system's intentional devaluation and of destruction of privacy. It is a system in which an individual peeping Tom cannot begin to compete with the big brother who's always watching too. The characters strive to escape the post office that defines this existence, but they never escape it entirely, and they end up reenacting the meaninglessness and patterns of their official encounters in their private lives as well. Or the other way around, the patterns of the post office interaction reveal a dimension of the private that would otherwise remain hidden from view. The private world cannot provide a genuine alternative to the bureaucratized world. It either does not escape it or it's not different. The post office setting raises but does not answer the following question. Is the separation and alienation of postal subjects a political effect, historically localizable, or a universal fact of the metaphysical kind? In the second post office scene, Magda requests to see the manager, who in turn accuses her of trying to defraud the state institution. The injustice is what prompts Tomek to run out after her and confess to her that the money notices were forged and that he had been watching her.
U pana dłoń?
U mnie?
Mam do bardzo.
Nie ma.
Ja przychodzę tutaj już drugi raz.
Ja wiem, proszę pani, ale nie ma.
Po raz drugi dostaję wezwanie, na które nie ma pokrycia.
Tak.
Bałagan.
Tak.
Czy mógł pan wezwać kogoś starszego?
Słucham?
Kogoś starszego, naczelnika. Czy kogoś?
Zaraz wracam. Słucham panią.
Tu jest jedno sprzed kilku dni, a tu drugie. Mam dwa wyzwania po pieniądze, a pieniędzy nie ma. Przekazu też nie.
No a Mizo, o co chodzi?
Ale pieniędzy nie ma.
Przekazy poproszę. Od kogo miały być te pieniądze?
Nie wiem. 24 000, ale nie wiem.
To skąd pani wie, że miały być?
No przecież mam wezwanie, już drugie awizo.
Przecież urzędnik mówił pani, że nie ma.
Jak może nie być? Skoro dostaję...
Panie Wacek! Panie Wacek!
Jestem pani naczelnik.
Co to za wezwania są?
Wystań.
Ale to na pana rejonie pan to wystawia?
Nie, ja. Ja wystawiam ołówkiem.
Były w mojej skrzynce.
Słyszy pani? To nie nasze wezwania są. Wyraźnie listonosz mówi.
Ale proszę pani, ja dostałam te wezwania do swojej skrzynki. A tych wezwaniach jest pieczątka pani poczty.
To jest państwowa poczta. Jak pani sobie sama wezwania wypisuje, to niech pani idzie na milicję, a nie my tu śledztwo urządza.
Ma pani rację. Na milicję. Poproszę te wezwania.
Tego pani na pewno nie dostanie. Fałszywe są. Pieniądze chciała wyłudzić.
Pan coś chce ode mnie?
Chciałem powiedzieć, że nie było żadnych pieniędzy.
A wiza?
Ja je wkładałem.
Po co?
Chciałem
Nie
panią-
rozumiem.
Chciałem panią zobaczyć.
Mnie? Nie pan chciał zobaczyć?
Pani wczoraj płakała!
Skąd pan?
Podgląda pani.
Co?
Podglądam panią przez okno.
Zmykaj. Spieprzę.
The subtitles are terribly translated, so here's a partial translation. It's going to be important to my reading of the scene. In this vignette, the forces are aligned in two opposed camps. On the one hand, we have the postal institution, which can presumably differentiate between real and forged money, real forged money notices, or between real and glycerin tears, and whose official stamps exist to guarantee that such distinctions are maintained. But the institution also exercises here its sovereign power to bring about a state of exception, an impasse of legality and illegality, by destroying evidence in the case. The shrill manager emphasizes the post office's standing as an organ of the state, only seconds before she tears up the notices that could have been given to the police. The manager's accusation of fraud and forgery leveled at Magda is left hanging at the end of the scene forever without any prospect of resolution. On the other hand, we have Tomek and Magda, whose attitudes evince a much more porous conception of the difference between real and forged, though in disparate ways. Tomek, to begin with, is a double agent who misappropriates the official seal for personal reasons. Tomek passes a counterfeit money notice not for monetary gain, or to dupe Magda with the face value of 24,000 zlotys, but in order to make her show up at the post office, literally to conjure her up like a visitation, and to forge a relationship. While Tomek issues this love summons, Magda assumes that she's in possession of a token of entitlement, and she arrives to demand the promised fulfillment, only to be told that she is holding a counterfeit. We have to wonder why she feels entitled to funds from an unknown source, but we should not overestimate the sum itself. Magda cannot expect any real windfall, and the actual amount is insignificant, not more than you would spend on one trip to a grocery store, if such a trip was possible at that time, in an era when pretty much everything was rationed and store shelves were filled to overflowing only with two immortal staples, bottles of vinegar and jars of pickles, for which reason I will never eat pickles again, neither of which seemed to be affected by the general economic catastrophe that followed the state of exception. All in all, neither Tomek nor Magda share the institution's self-important interpretation that a counterfeit is always a counterfeit, or that a counterfeit is a forged or false version of the real. The counterfeit money order reveals its richest possibilities when allowed to signify as an image of human relations, like the glass partition or the post office itself. Entering a relationship may well resemble coming to a post office bearing a money order in one's hand. You assume you are in possession of a good check, but you may well find that you have a bad one. The postal notice evokes all the unfounded expectations, the demands that cannot be met, the values that can be trusted but not demonstrated, and the hopes against all odds that there should be someone on the other end who will cash the check, even if it's worthless, and if they broke. That is, in short, Magda's situation. On the other hand, Tomek's approach to the postal notice manifests a naive and magical belief that love interests override all other interests, and that the appearance itself of the beloved will lead to a transubstantiation of desire into the currency of mutuality. And I feel like I'm describing Martin's secular faith from yesterday. One of the most striking linguistic features of this dialogue, which connects it with other moments in the film, is the echoing repetition of the phrase, "It's not there," also translated in subtitles as nothing, but it's a very bad translation. In this dialogue, the phrase is used 6 times, and it brings the viewer back to its previous appearance during Magda's first attempt to cash the money notice in the film's opening sequence. In the Polish dialogue, the phrase is shorter and more ambivalent, nie ma. For instance, in this earlier scene, Magda, aviso, postal notice. Tomek, nie ma, nothing, not there. Magda, ale ja mam wezwanie, but I've got a notice. Tomek, nie ma, there is nothing. Nie ma is an idiomatic and ubiquitous expression that literally means not has, where nie is no and ma is the third person singular of the verb to have, mieć. The fact that the phrase has no word in the subject slot is not in itself surprising. Polish allows the subject to be omitted because the verb itself usually carries grammatical markers that prevent misunderstanding. But this is not the case here. Nie ma is a so-called sentence equivalent that does not point to a subject. It's not a sentence fragment because Polish syntax is more forgiving. There is no substitute here for the comforting it that English uses as a placeholder in expressions such as "it's not there." Grammatically, nie ma is a subjectless sentence. It could acquire a logical subject, which if expressed would follow the expression in the genitive case. For instance, nie ma pieniędzy, there is no money, or nie ma chleba, there is no bread. But this logical subject, money or bread, is not the grammatical subject of the sentence, not the human subject we would expect to be the solid basis of all having. The first thing to say then is that nothing can constitute only a very loose translation for the Polish nie ma, which conveys something simultaneously less portentous and more elusive than the English noun. "It's not there" does not work either, as it's too concrete and grammatically complete to convey the unsettling open-endedness and subjectless dispossession that inhere in the Polish phrase. Nie ma indicates a state of deprivation that is not expressible by means of a conceptual noun, such as nothing or lack, a state of being without or having not. In the post office scene, nie ma names the state of exception that the scene illustrates. To begin with, there is no money to cover the money notice because the notice is forged. Then, the state of illegality is doubled when the notice is torn up, and there is no longer evidence that a forgery has taken place. There is no money, there is no evidence. The person who is accused of forgery and fraud, Magda, is the only one who committed no crime whatsoever. The notice was forged by Tomek and torn up by the manager. And yet she finds herself the subject without grammatical subject of a double deprivation. Tomek, too, fails to conjure up a mutuality he broke the rules for. There is no love. The film is ultimately about the state of exception described by the phrase nie ma. It raises 2 fundamental questions pertaining to the logical and grammatical subjects of the phrase. What is missing? What is the it that's not there? And who or what is missing that which is missing? The questions may be unanswerable, but they can be usefully contextualized in another key sequence of the film. The film entertains the question of love. It is, after all, a short film about love, in the most unlikely of ways. Out of what looks very much like a voyeuristic perversion or the adultery of the 6th commandment, if we want to go there, that brings together 2 people who should have never met and who make the very possibility of mutuality seem impossible, risible, sinful, depending on the perspective. But this makes this question all the more urgent. The key scene here takes place when Tomek delivers milk to Magda's apartment. Milk is an extremely important substance in the film, but it is beyond the scope of this talk. When Magda asks, why do you peep at me? Tomek establishes the film's credo by stating, because I love you. I really love you.
Naprawdę kocham panią.
I czego? Czego chcesz?
Nie.
Chcesz mnie pocałować?
Nie.
Może chcesz iść ze mną do... Może chcesz się ze mną kochać?
Nie.
To co chcesz?
Nic.
Nic?
Czy mógłbym panią zaprosić do kawiarni? Na rok.
No fault.
Prasa.
Tomek does not really love her, and Magda does not learn the meaning of love by the end of the film either. There is no chance of a mutuality here, but the film still engages the question of love with utter seriousness. Six examines love through its suspensions and absences, through its crises and states of exception. It may simply be that Tomek is naive, romantic, immature, repressed, in denial, or what have you. But it is important that Tomek does not spy on Magda simply out of sexual need. When he inherits his friend's voyeuristic toolbox, he importantly fails to become a true voyeur himself. When queried, "And what do you want?" he replies that he does not know. And when she again probes incredulously and insistently, "What do you want?" he emphatically states that he wants nothing. Nothing? Nothing. Nothing, not because he's too young or too shy, and not because he prefers to be aroused from behind a telescope than in the flesh. We might do well to take him at his word. This is, I would venture, the film's urgent demand on us as viewers. What does he want? For once, it's not what does the woman want, or not so much. What is the nature of his want? And what might, if anything, constitute its satisfaction? What does it mean to want nothing? And I'm not really asking this question in a Lacanian sense either. He wavers in his response between "I don't know" and "nothing," and these responses too should be taken seriously. At the very least, what he desires is not simply the sexual thing. The exchange ends when Tomek asks Magda, "Could I invite you to a cafe for ice cream?" Magda's response to Tomek's invitation is not shown, but we glean what it might have been by Tomek's ecstatic reaction. In jubilation, he goes in circles with the clinking milk wagon in tow in front of the apartment building. The cacophony of milk bottles is set to the haunting melodies of Zbigniew Preisner's score, and the scene is bookended by extreme high-angle shots that frame it as taking place at a crossroads, where four paths meet by the side of a weeping willow. When the camera begins to track Tomek's movement in close-up, the image of the world beyond him dissolves into spinning smudges of light. This is both a triumph of Kieslowski's film art and an intimation that within the film's nie ma, there inheres at least a potential for something very much like ecstasy. But the film does not allow us to rest there. This is the absolutely last scene of the TV version of the film.
Ja już pani nie podglądam.
After Tomek's suicide attempt, this possibility that Niema opens an ecstatic space is closed off. Kieslowski has taught us, peeping, Kieslowski has taught us, signified an opening of the self to another, and it offered a sort of mirage of transcendence. The movement toward the other remained a possibility within it. At the end of 6, Magda is cupping her hands around her face, hoping to see Tomek within the post office. She is now separated from him by the smudged external pane of glass, as well as the office window. Though gazes finally meet through the circular opening, the connection is not there. And we are left with a state of exception marked by dearth of love, money, milk, mutuality. Even secular faith does not seem to transcend the omnipresent panes of glass. Thank you.
Our next speaker is Kevin Lamb. He is, I will describe him as a polymath. He seems to reinvent his intellectual life every few years. And after I'm just remembering his application to Cornell with its what seemed like a dissertation-length study of Russian gay politics, after which he became a math teacher. That's usually not the path to a Cornell PhD in English, where his focus was on British and French modernism, literary theory, and queer theory. After his PhD, he was appointed to the Society of Fellows at Columbia, where I recall he was teaching a lot of classical philosophy and just taking on ancient Greek. So he's moved around quite a bit, and he has since become a lawyer, having recently completed his JD at Yale Law School and accepted 2 prestigious judicial clerkships, one most recently where he is currently with Judge Guido Calabrese on the U.S. Court of Appeals Second Circuit. His Cornell dissertation, completed in 2007, was entitled Impersonality and the Modernist Art of Critique, a study of the paradoxically personal style of impersonal criticism in such great queer critics as Oscar Wilde, Roland Barthes, and Michel Foucault. He was still a graduate student here also when he edited a collection of essays with Jonathan on that very subject of the style of theory, entitled Just Being Difficult, Academic Writing in the Public Arena. Please welcome Kevin Lamb.
So I hadn't prepared to say anything by way of gratitude toward Jonathan at the beginning, but since that seems now a requirement, I am very happy to do so. I certainly won't start in the formula that has become now standard at this conference, which is to say I am where I am because of Jonathan, since that would not seem unequivocal praise. But I will say that there is a kind of intergenerational story here, and was actually the reason in some ways that I went to graduate school. Having been your student, I finished a math degree in 3 years actually at UT, and I didn't have any requirements to take math, so in order to understand Russia, where I'd spent a year, I took a course with Anne on the politics of sexuality and lesbian cultures, which was forbidden fruit, and that led to the lost decade, as I like to call it. I mean it half jokingly, but I will say that I wasn't also planning to share an anecdote about Jonathan as a teacher, but I think that it's important to say I do continue to inherit his model as a theorist and as a thinker. And one of the ways in which he struck me as a teacher was not actually by way of his writing or his teaching per se as a lecturer. I actually found Jonathan surprisingly much better as a teacher in his writing than as a teacher in person. I found him, wonderfully clear in his way that he is, but he was very modest as a teacher. And, there were a few moments in classes when he would do what I like to think of as the claw. When there was a particular moment, it would come up and it would say, that point has been made, very well. But he wasn't a flashy teacher in that way. He didn't make teaching seem like it was more than actually trying to convey ideas that were already flashy and interesting in clear ways so that people could understand them and feel that they had been authoritatively explained. But I was very struck by an experience I had when I was his TA for the literature and theory class, and I had graded my first set of papers and went to talk to him so that we could compare what counted as certain grades. I'd given someone a C, I believe, and Jonathan read through the paper and in a moment went through and explained a possible series of steps that might have arrived at something that would resemble understanding. And all I remember is a series of impressions that I went through in response. First, that's absurd. That doesn't count as understanding. And then secondly, this is Paul de Man. This is the resistance to theory being converted into theory, a way of thinking that is responsive to what someone is presenting and actually thinking through the place from which they start, the language that they've used in order to see where it is that a series of steps have been converted into understanding or not. And I continue to think of him as someone who is incredibly responsive, incredibly patient in his thinking, for particularly people who are not always, let's say, for whom theory does not always come easily. And so that was something that I learned from him, and I have always appreciated that sense and tried to exemplify that in my own teaching and continue to try to exemplify it in my own way of relating to the world. So the topic of my talk is the passion of theory. Since, however, I am unwilling or unprepared, even after some years of thinking about the topic, to venture a systematic account of it, what I have to offer today are some examples, with some reflections on their possible role in our disciplines and democracy. My puzzle is how to fit the theoretical humanities into our disciplinary and democratic ideals. What sort of freedom and what sort of authority, if any of either, can academic criticism in general and literary theory in particular claim? Two models at once present themselves. The first is the authority and freedom of the expert who speaks from within a recognizable discipline. The second is that of the citizen speaking on matters of public importance. Both models, both the disciplinary speech of experts and the public discourse of citizens, entail rights. The sundry justifications of the humanities obviously draw from these two models, casting the humanities either as leading to a mastery of technical skills or as fostering a reflective citizenry. But what other models do we have? If these models are the only ones, must criticism and theory follow one or the other, exemplifying either the speech of one trained in the methods of a discipline or the speech of one seeking to persuade others in the undisciplined space of public discourse? Do rights attach to speech only in these two modes? One starting point for thinking about such questions is the migrant or itinerant status of theory itself. Judith Butler, in her 1999 preface to Gender Trouble, remarks that while grammatically indicating a kind of unity, theory is actually the displacement of disparate French thinkers with few alliances and little in common. Indeed, the word theory by itself, with no article preceding it, is a marked usage in English, like the bare word critique. These strange usages raise natural questions. Theory of what? Critique of what? And in many ways, theory, despite its domestication in departments of literature, remains a foreign tongue in translation. I think that undergrads who get excited about it are also undergrads who enjoy learning foreign languages. One may be tempted then to give theory a purely disciplinary inflection. On more than one occasion, Jonathan himself has defined theory as that which succeeds in moving outside its discipline of origin to transform thinking in other fields. Indeed, to the extent that theory both originates within and unsettles disciplines, the fact of disciplines and the movement between them are crucial. Such an account, however, is wildly over-inclusive. Behavioral economics, for instance, steals from psychology to challenge classic economic models. But it is not theory, not as I, and I suspect all of you, use the word. The problem is that at this level of generality, where theory is described by its interdisciplinary effects rather than its substantive commitments or its objects and methods of study, one can say very little about its value either to research institutions or to larger democratic ideals. The mere fact of movement between disciplines does not tell us what disciplines are good for, or why one might work to preserve or to reform them, or to preserve some in some forms, revising or abandoning others. Robert Post, who is Dean of Yale Law School, has recently sought to put disciplinary expertise on firmer constitutional ground by tying such expertise to a theory of democracy that is implicit in the First Amendment. Public discourse and disciplinary expertise each implicate First Amendment values, but they do so in distinct ways. The value tied to public discourse is what Post calls democratic legitimation. Only if the state is potentially responsive to public opinion can the will of all in a democracy, what Rousseau called the general will, be reconciled with the concrete exercise of governmental authority. To serve this legitimating function, public discourse must therefore be open to all on non-discriminatory terms. In contrast, the value served by expertise is what Post calls democratic competence. To be competent to steer official action, public discourse must be infused with independent sources of reliable knowledge. And the disciplines are such sources only under conditions of academic freedom. A state that can manipulate research can manufacture consent. Democratic legitimation requires then democratic competence. The First Amendment challenge, as Post elaborates it, is to coordinate these two interlocked yet partially discordant values. Because democratic legitimation centers on the speaker's own interest in influencing public opinion, public discourse is characterized by epistemic egalitarianism. The production of expert knowledge, in contrast, is built on institutional hierarchies, methodological norms, and selective participation, structures incompatible with the speaker-centered value of democratic legitimation. The reason to insulate expertise from the state from intrusion by the state derives not from the scholar's own interest in self-expression, but from the public's interest in reliable knowledge. As Post points out, the Supreme Court has recognized such a listener-centered value as part of the First Amendment in the doctrine of commercial speech, a doctrine originally founded on the idea that the dissemination of truthful information as part of the market is vital to democratic decision-making on larger economic issues. The difference in rationales here, supporting public discourse on the one hand and disciplinary expertise on the other, leads to different scopes of protection. To compel speech in public discourse is the height of unconstitutionality. In expert and commercial settings, compulsory disclosure of facts is constitutional and often desirable. The state itself requires valid data to regulate against various harms to the public. Preserving the integrity of both public discourse and disciplinary expertise requires judicial boundary drawing, because the First Amendment values served are domain-specific and often incompatible. Consider, for example, doctors who are licensed by the state, but whose practice is tied to medical knowledge. What may a doctor say to a woman considering having an abortion, or a psychiatrist to parents wishing to change a child's sexual orientation? What sort of speech is the state permitted here to compel or to prohibit? In order to adjudicate, courts must be able to differentiate between doctor and citizen, between collective will and scientific consensus, what the public wants and what the relevant experts certify as fact. Post's account undeniably privileges science as the model of expertise, as he recognizes what counts as knowledge in the humanities is more controversial and unsettled. Nevertheless, for Post, standards of disciplinary knowledge are essential to freedom from extramural supervision, and those who purport to speak merely as sage amateurs conveying alert views to fellow citizens have no First Amendment right to be shielded from public censure. Enter high theory. Insofar as conformity with disciplinary norms is a condition of academic freedom, theory as a form of interdisciplinary movement would seem not to fit. Yet disciplinary norms, like the research communities that enforce them, are not static, but organic. For Post, in fact, the constant mitosis of the sciences into ever finer subfields is a sign of disciplinary vitality, evidence that research is adapting to new technologies, problems, approaches, and agendas. It is a genuine puzzle to Post why the humanities, in contrast, appear unable to transcend four basic methodological templates, what he calls the textual exegesis of literary criticism, the analytics of philosophy, the narratives of history, and the cultural hermeneutics of anthropology. Interdisciplinarity may be touted as a virtue in the humanities, but Post perceives a certain obduracy in the ease with which objects like race or gender are assimilated to traditional methods, even as they spawn new departments and research institutes. If theory poses a challenge for academic freedom, then it is not because it is interdisciplinary. Behavioral economics, which is similarly interdisciplinary, yields testable knowledge. The question is whether works of theory do. Some doubtless do. Foucault's studies of madness and sexuality contain empirical claims, albeit highly conceptual ones. Of course, history differs from other humanities in being readily susceptible to the paradigm of knowledge. Indeed, my own fear is not that the humanities produce something else aside from knowledge, but that they are too quick to turn themselves into history to be seen as producing knowledge. I like history. Some of my best friends are historians. Yet if the epistemic stakes of historical work are easier to assert and to recognize than those of non-historical work, history will be overtrod as the path of least resistance, with the result that other underutilized paths within the humanities become harder still to perceive as worthwhile. Of undeniable importance to theory was something altogether strange from the perspective of disciplinary knowledge, namely J.L. Austin's discovery of the performative. At once a separate category of speech acts and a dimension of every speech act, the performative had not previously been remarked by philosophers who were interested in statements, propositions about the world that are true or false, and hence the grist of cognition. In characterizing certain utterances as performative, did Austin tell us something that we did not know before? Certainly his demonstration of his discovery is shockingly bare. He adduces a few examples, saying, I do at the altar, or I bet, or I bequeath. then pronounces that none of these are matters of truth, a fact that he asserts is obvious. To see it is to know what we say when, but we knew that already, which is why the fact that the words in these examples cannot be said to be true or false, that they perform the act described, needs, as he says, no argument. A great inheritor of Austin, Stanley Cavell, describes the subject of criticism here as the subject of examples, likening the philosopher's mode of claiming what we say when to our implicit demand of agreement in aesthetic judgments, what Kant in the Third Critique calls our speaking with a universal voice. The authority for such claims lies in their appeal to a kind of abstract autobiography, the voice of the community, for which the test is the speaker's own exemplarity. As a result, the deep undercurrents of such criticism are not ignorance and knowledge, but in Cavell's terms, acknowledgement and avoidance, the bringing near and shunning of what one cannot fail to know except as a matter of repression, lostness, despair, or madness. The study of ordinary language enters philosophy as therapy for these conditions. Cavell's association of ordinary language philosophy with autobiography and therapy has predictably led both his detractors and his proponents to cast his work in terms of an ideal of authenticity. I have elsewhere stated my reasons for thinking that this reception of Cavell obscures rather than illuminates his representativeness as a thinker. Suffice for now that to take seriously being true to oneself in Cavell, we would first have to confront his insistence that humans are the sort of creature who are recurrently gripped by a fantasy of privacy, of selfhood as inner, hence fated alternately to inescapable publicity and suffocating inexpressiveness. If ordinary language philosophy is therapy, what it is therapy for is that fantasy. But for therapy to mean anything, then, the fantasy must be mine to begin with. Wittgenstein notoriously figures this predicament as the bewitchment of our understanding by means of our language. It is as different evasions of this same predicament that Cavell criticizes Austin himself, as well as Austin's literary appropriators like de Man. For Austin, averting self-mystification was simply a matter of not taking the paths that lead to it. For Cavell, as for Wittgenstein, that gesture, valuable so far as it goes, falls at times short of the power against it. We are not merely victim, but agent in this bewitchment. In fits of skepticism, where language appears pure convention, entirely public and outer, we speak in emptiness, lost to our own words. Yet such fits also voice our longing for the language we lack because of the language we have. Skepticism cannot, it seems, be rooted out, say, as plain error, without denying its truth, without denying, that is, the truth of the skeptic's desires and disappointments, and hence, without falling prey to the same assertiveness that led to the images of privacy and emptiness in the first place. Cavell's analogy to psychoanalysis is instructive in that diagnosing one's skepticism involves retracing one's own linguistic roots, something more clearly pictured as a struggle of intrapsychic forces or agencies than as a matter of replacing false propositions with true ones or one theory of language with another. In Cavell's reading of Wittgenstein's philosophical investigations, these forces are personified by two voices of the text, the voice of correction and the voice of temptation. If Austin's problem is that he stifles temptation, never picturing its force or the forces that must therefore be mustered against it, Cavell reads Austin's literary progeny like de Man to embody the opposite extreme. They aggrandize temptation. In the work of a theorist like Judith Butler, however, it seems to me that a third voice, call it the voice of passion, interrupts the voices of correction and temptation and illustrates a dimension of theory that is still to be received, that is, as Cavell writes of Wittgenstein's work, essentially and always to be received, as thoughts must be that would refuse professionalization. In fabricating terms for such a reception, I would add that the passion exemplified by Butler's work refuses personalization as well, that resistance to the norms of one's profession is joined to an art of voluntary depersonalization. Aptly enough, the voices of correction and of temptation correspond to two well-known criticisms of Butler's work, particularly her account of gender performativity. One criticism, the charge of voluntarism, took the example of drag to imply the kind of doing that gender is can be undone at will, as if parody floated free from the context of mundane performance. Butler's correction to this temptation was to stress that gender is an assignment, the execution of which is governed by norms whose force and changeability both lie in the necessity of iteration. But this response also lent itself to the other classic criticism of her work, namely the charge of normative insufficiency, that iterability by itself supplies no criteria by which to distinguish norm-reinforcing from norm-subverting iterations. The interplay of these voices in Butler's account of gender bears productive comparison with the central scene of instruction in the Philosophical Investigations, where Wittgenstein writes, quote, "Once I've exhausted the justifications, I have reached bedrock, and my spade is turned. Then I'm inclined to say, this is simply what I do," unquote. The image of bedrock has suggested fixity to some commentators. For Cavell, who imagines the scene as between a teacher and pupil, the figure of the turned spade on bedrock where justifications have run out turns me back upon myself, where something is now to be shown. What I do, what I am inclined to say that I do, and whether I might be inclined otherwise. Nothing here follows as a matter of inference or logic. What I am calling the voice of passion in Butler's work is the call in such scenes for patience in the face of suffering, where, for example, the one who instructs confronts the child for whom gender is not an assignment that comes easily, and where the question is thus whether to impose a recognizable gender in the name of community or whether to forbear in the name of criticism, to tarry with the difficulty of the child's being unable to do what others do quite naturally, and perhaps to find oneself undone in the process. In the latter case, I may not claim for myself the authority of the community. At the same time, I instigate a relation to the one in pain that acknowledges rather than avoids my own authorship in that community. Since teacher and pupil name variable roles, these scenes recur throughout our lives and in fact constitute part of our socialization in several contexts, including in the training of disciplinary research and writing. To know what we say when as a shared form of life is the traditional province of the performative. Yet Cavell suggests a possible supplement or countermodel that he names passionate utterance, where passion figures both are being acted on, hence its etymological link to passivity and patience, and our suffering, being affected, subject to pain, desire, emotion. Unlike the performative utterance, which is underwritten by custom, backed by procedures and witnesses who hold participants accountable for their performance, passionate utterances broach that for which no convention yet exists, that which solicits forbearance and invites one to share in the disorders of desire. This dimension of theory, passion, is, as I say, still to be received. To govern ourselves, we need tools for grasping the world. Yet the disciplines do not settle the disorders of desire. Indeed, our ongoing quarrel with authority over our own authorship in our lives will not be won by knowledge or by argument, but neither then should it be lost for lack of passion in our thinking.
To arrive in graduate school to do Victorian literature and queer studies at just the moment when Jeff Nunokawa was hired. I don't think I would have been able to easily imagine that at Princeton, but after he was there, it became quite easy to imagine at Princeton. He is now a professor of English there, as well as the master of Rockefeller College. He published his Cornell dissertation under the title The Afterlife of Property, Domestic Security, and the Victorian Novel in 1994. He's also written extensively on Oscar Wilde, including his book Tame Passions of Wilde, The Styles of Manageable Desire, which is about the aspiration to imagine a form of desire that is nevertheless light as the daydream or thought experiment, and preferably lighter than a prison sentence for gross indecency, writing very differently on Oscar Wilde, I think. And he's going to speak today from his new project, which is quite a change of direction, an online project. He's become a legendary blogger, and the title of that project is Notebook. Please welcome Jeff Nunokawa.
I should say that actually this is what I'm going to read from today is a book which will be published in May, and the title of the book is Notebook, and that's that. And I'm mindful of the time, so I'll be mindful of the time as I go over. I'm kidding. The book I will publish soon is a small selection from a big stock of brief essays that I've written every day, one a day, over the course of what has been many years now. Funny how remembering a standing date can make you forget the passing of the years during which you keep it. I write and disseminate these essays on Facebook using its little noticed notes option. I also revise them there, and revise them, and revise them, and revise them. One of the many charms of the notes function on Facebook is how it allows you to revise what you've already virtually published to your heart's content. I'm put in mind of a remark a friend made years ago about an advertisement for Sunday brunch at the Holiday Inn here, which included quoting, "all the Chablis you care to enjoy, and then some," my friend remarked, "and then some." My point being that the notes option on Facebook allows you to perform all the revision you care to enjoy, and then some. Many is the day I mostly spent making small and large changes in the brief meditation pertaining thereto. By the way, of all the people who've been here, I think I'm the person who's least conspicuously involved with Jonathan's work, and yet I'm more and more aware of my debt to him, a debt I think greater than he knows, and certainly I think also greater than I've known until quite recently. And I'll recur to that at the end of this brief talk. Anyway, about these essays, I just want to give you some sense of the format of the essays before I launch into them. They usually begin with a quotation, typically literary or philosophical in nature, although sometimes from some relatively recent or out-of-date biography of Eleanor Roosevelt, or a study of Lou Kahn, or a guide to Madrid, or a living letter from a dead friend, or something else that happens to catch my eye that day. These quotations are followed by what I have to say more or less directly about them. The relation between what I talk about in my brief little essay and the text about which I am supposedly talking may not always be as explicit as those of us accustomed to the contemporary protocols of critical responsiveness are trained to expect, but they are certainly always incited by it. They are incited as much by them as a hidden God, or a powerful parent, or a love or a loss that touches everything we do, often most tellingly, by not saying so and not saying how. Over time, I have grown closer and closer in these notes to the text that I take up in them, so much so that I have wound up mixing them more and more with stories from my own life and yours, the adventures of heart and mind we share as citizens of a state of heart and mind, whose messages are conveyed by social media, ranging from the most well-preserved canon, in comma, to the bright lights and warp speeds of the internet. As the years have passed, these notes have grown less and less formal expositions and explications of the text where they get their start, and more emulations and extensions of them. Here is an irony as old as the hills and as any story of introjection told in prose or rhyme. As these notes have become less detached from and more involved with the text that brought them into being, the texts themselves have sometimes disappeared from view, their influence most acute at their vanishing, like so many of the things that carry us through, like so many of the things that we carry and carry on. All this is to say that however removed they may seem from them, these are essays. I would like to hold these up as essays in criticism, in some familiar, though sometimes forgotten, old and new sense. The great answers of this little adventure in the essay form, Montaigne, Bacon, Johnson, De Quincey, Benjamin, Barth, inter alia, always sought through their words to honor by illuminating the words of others, words that enshrine and encourage some way brave, somewhat frightened and fractured parts of the lives that we somehow lead and lead together. Now I'm going to just read a brief sampling of these. I've skipped over an entire section of this introduction, which has to do with the character of what I'm writing now is what I'll call late middle-aged criticism. I'll just skip all over that, just to stipulate that. So I'm just wondering, I'll read them, with each little titles you'll see. Note 5272, almost like being in love. When I feel, fair creature of an hour, that I shall never look upon thee more, never have relish in the fairy power of unreflecting love. As you know, that's Keats, When I Have Fears. And this is me now. I don't remember much of what love like that feels like, that feeling of being all in and not being sure what it is that you're into, except that it's something that hurts and that can only be helped by something that hurts even more. Maybe that's why I surround myself with souvenirs of that feeling. pictures and poems that remind me a little of what that hurt and helping feeling feels like. Sometimes losing that feeling feels like carelessness, like what Wilde said about losing both parents, quoting, "To lose one parent may be regarded as a misfortune. To lose both looks like carelessness." I'll tell you what, though. It may have been careless of me to lose that feeling in the first place, but I sure care a lot about it now that I've lost it. Sometimes I think I care almost as much about being far away from that feeling as I once did about being far away from the faces that brought that feeling on. There was that summer after senior year when I was back home in Hawaii and he in Eastern Canada. I still don't know how I survived that summer. I don't mind the feeling that comes from missing that feeling so much, though. It makes me feel like I've got something in common with people who still have it. Whenever you're missing something badly enough, you've always got something to talk about with other people who are missing something badly too. There's always a chance to trade notes. I should also mention that part of the apparatus of these little essays is a note in the place of a scholarly note. So the note here is, "Those poor dreams which have at one time or another been in the heads of more men than you may think." That's what Jagger says to Pip in Great Expectations. Note 5269, usual note. "Some discouragement, some faintness of heart at the new real future." That's a very famous passage, very famous line from what is doubtless the most famous passage from Middlemarch, where Dorothea Brooke is weeping on her wedding tour. "Some discouragement, some faintness of heart at the new real future." Mina. "Once you reach a certain age, your weekends tend to get lost not in a high life, but one where your feet never leave the ground. Nowadays, if I don't remember much about what I did on Saturday night, it's not because I did anything unusual, but because I didn't. Sometimes when the last of the weekend rolls around and the old feeling of Sunday afternoon comes back to hit me, less like the feeling of fun day, more like the feeling of sin day, I get unhappy thinking about that." Quoting now, "I just thought there'd be more," a woman in a movie I saw last Saturday night said. Not this past Saturday night, but the one before that, though really, what's the difference? She meant more to life. This is the mother in the movie Boyhood. She meant more to life. She was seeing her son leave for college, and I think she was expecting some kind of soundtrack or secret passage or whatever it is we privately hope will lift us from the ordinary after we've done our ordinary work. I thought there'd be more too. More sightings of some other side, more savings from the aching feeling that something's missing, something that would give heat to our bodies and heart to our being. But then this, a message from a former student, now in medical school, writing to tell me how he'd come back to a passage from Eliot that I and many others spend a good deal of our lives teaching. I've quoted part of the passage above. It goes on to talk about having a keen vision and feeling of all ordinary human life. Here is what my student had to say. "There is much talk in medical school about saving the world, or of saving lives. But of course, life isn't lived in dreams, however grand, but in ordinary things, things which we could treat so easily with disgust precisely because of their ordinariness. Important things to keep in mind as one professes to care for others. Sometimes, all it takes to save someone's day is to write to remind him that salvation, when it comes, does so one day at a time. Note, some natural tears they dropped, but wiped them soon. The world was all before them." Milton, Paradise Lost. Note 5262. "Least hope, most life." "Mr. Knightley, I only want to know that Mr. Martin is not very bitterly disappointed. A man cannot be more so," was his short, full answer. Wait, what's he saying exactly? Is he saying a man can't be more disappointed or a man can't be more a man? Maybe a little both. Maybe a man who can't be more disappointed, a suitor say, refused what he hoped with all his heart to have. Can't be more a man. Maybe it's that. It wouldn't be the first time that someone comes most to life when the hope that made it sweet most leaves it. And it wouldn't be the last. Note, "Goodbye, my love, goodbye." The song, "Goodbye, my love, goodbye." Eating Club. Note 5255. Charles is a marvelous cook. Still, there are meals he serves that make me wonder, as tonight, what it all means and what my neighbor feels. James Merrill, table talk. I don't like scheduling meals in advance. Of course I do it anyway, since otherwise I'd never see all kinds of people I really want to see. Still though, it's not something I like to do. It's like what a kid said to me recently. When people ask me if I want to make a date for dinner 2 weeks from now, I want to say, how will I know if I feel like seeing you in 2 weeks? He farms and works at a restaurant now, so I figure he must have made peace with the problem. I guess we all do. Otherwise, how would we ever show our hope that there are things we all want? A square meal, some solid love, a familiar style. Otherwise, how would we ever look forward to those over-the-table times when we don't have to wonder, even at our strangest, whether we know how our neighbor feels? Note, I'm quoting Albert Hirschman's essay on Zimmel, or one of his essays on Zimmel, quoting, Zimmel's basic insight about the shared meal providing a connection between two very different spheres, those of the selfish individual appetite and of the social collective. I just have one more to read now, so I'm going to be quite brief. And this is what I wrote today, this morning, and you'll see why it's important. The title of this note is Giving It Up. 52880, Giving It Up. Where kept? Where kept? Do but tell us where kept. Where? Yonder. What high is that? We follow. Now we follow. Yonder. Yes, yonder, yonder, yonder. I'm quoting the conclusion, as I know many people in this room know, of Hopkins, Gerard Manley Hopkins' poem, The Leaden Echo and the Golden Echo. This is the end of a pretty long and hard poem, all of which a teacher, an old friend really, recited to me last night after dinner. He knows it by heart. Maybe he missed a phrase here or there, but I didn't notice. The poem is about how we lose everything lovely that comes our way, which is a little funny when you think about it, since the poem itself is as lovely as they come, and my teacher has kept it close to him for many years, close enough to know by heart. A distinguished senior scholar, he sounded, while he recited the poem, a little like the proud schoolboy I suppose that he was when he first committed it to memory. But he won't remember it forever. And none of us who were there last night will forever remember the sound of him reciting it. Even now, just the morning after, the charm of his enunciation I can't quite bring back. Us. Oh, did I forget to mention that we weren't alone at the table? I did. Also, I forgot to mention what the lines from the poem that I quoted above are about. They're about where everything lovely goes after we give it up. The poem's not super clear about where exactly. I guess it's somewhere high, and I guess it's somewhere near remembering that when you speak and when you listen, you're sometimes less alone than you sometimes think you are. Note, when the thing we freely forfeit is kept with fonder care. Hopkins, Leaden Echo and the Golden Echo. Thank you.
What about the Golden Echo? You said the leaden part, but it is kept with fonder care. That is, that it goes from despair to spared. You're going the wrong way. You can be happy about this. I think that's I'm saying I want you to be. That's, I guess, I'm wrong.
No, I mean, just to answer the question, though, I mean, the point of the note was precisely to, as it were, embody the second half.
Mark. Thank you. That was a really great closing panel. I just want to ask Kevin something, and the reason I'm asking the question is also allows us perhaps to speak a little more about this term theory that's been floating around, and Mark was also intimating earlier, perhaps its sort of specificity to American academia. Certainly, I was someone who was very unfriendly to the term when I arrived here. Didn't want to speak about what I did as theory, but what actually won me over to that term can be useful is Jonathan's fourfold definition that he gives in his introductory book to literary theory. And you mentioned the first point of that, namely that theory is interdisciplinary, and pointed out that that's insufficient. But I wonder, once we have the fourfold definition that Jonathan gives, if you still think it's insufficient. And I thought I would, to the best of my memory, recall what the fourfold definition is, since it's, for me, it's actually established the term, and when my students ask me what theory is, I always answer this. So the first is correctly that it's interdisciplinary, that has effects outside of its original discipline. The second is that it's analytical and speculative, that is to say that it's attempts to work out what we mean by very basic terms like subject, meaning, language, etc. The third, that it has to be a critique of common sense, of concepts we take as natural and problematize them. And fourthly, is that it's inherently reflective, that is to say, it's a reflection upon the categories that we use to make things intelligible. It's a thinking about thinking. And once that fourfold definition is in place, I'm happy to say that I'm doing theory. And I wonder if there's still something in that fourfold definition that you find to be too capacious, or if it was just around the interdisciplinary, and more expansively, how that fits into the claims you wanted to make for theory. And
I don't find anything, particularly insufficient about that definition. I always think that the definitions Jonathan gives of things are wonderfully clarifying for people and focusing their attention on objects. And there may be things that fall in that because theory has developed as a canon, that it still make it over-inclusive as a definition, but that doesn't really matter to me. We call things theory, and we use that in particular ways. And there might be the fourfold might also be under-inclusive. In other words, there might be things that Giorgio Agamben writes that are more explications of text than they are actually doing this fundamental work of taking a concept that we take to be natural and for which there's some reflexive activity at the end of it. That's fine too if we still call them theory because we're happy to have those part of a canon that we're thinking through. That's fine with me. I don't have a particular attachment to the word theory. I think, as Jonathan knows well and as Ellis knows well, the principal term for me was critique in my own doctoral research. So theory was in some ways an informative set of texts that I drew from, but it wasn't what focused my own attention. I don't know what value you get from calling something interdisciplinary. That's the only part that I want to sort of critique, and I have no interest in the other part. In other words, the fact that something's interdisciplinary doesn't say that it hasn't been appropriated to some sub-method within some discipline. It also doesn't tell you the knowledge status, the epistemic status. If you call it speculative, then that at least takes it out of the realm of the social sciences and the sciences to some degree. So you don't think that you're doing empirical research, but then you think of historical claims as sometimes speculative, and they have knowledge content, and people feel happy to falsify them by looking at evidence to see whether they're true or false. So that won't quite do. But those are the things that I'm principally concerned with, are the knowledge status of the disciplines and what else we're doing in the humanities, and why history maybe shouldn't be a dominant crutch for cashing out every claim, so that we can say, hey, look, we're doing knowledge just like everyone else.
Jim, that was really a kind of a remarkable, lovely way to end this day and a half, and it was extremely interesting, if not touching, to hear you read the notes, which many of us have been reading for a long time and look forward to. I was wondering, given the discussion of the literary and belief that it kind of permeated this day and a half, if you could say something about the grain of the voice and the importance, what appears to be clearly the importance of address in this writing.
A little bit. Something like this, and I actually only a little bit, but I can't do it very well because I'm just so exhausted. But I think what it comes down to is something like this. I've gotten really interested in fact, this actually has to do a little bit with what Martin was saying yesterday, with writing and not knowing whom I'm addressing, not knowing who's out there. I've gotten very, very aware in the last couple of years that I'm both not reaching and reaching. I have no idea
except people will say, oh, you know, this, that, and the other. I'm very aware of that. I'm also very aware that the texts that are talking through me, or the things that are talking through me, would never have guessed that they would. Exactly. I'm very aware that that half of what I'm writing now, these words, they're very. You know, I just threw a lot of it was a brief talk, I hope, but it was, I can't remember the time, I'm losing my sense of time. But it's very impacted. There's a lot of, you know, the Merrill quotation, and then there's the Lamb there, and then there's the Quincy, and then there's the Albert Hirschman, being very cute in a certain way. But I don't care whether or not people get all that shit. I mean, what I care, you know, it's like what David Miller, who's not here except in my head, said once about when he wrote this book about Jane Austen. He said, I wanted to write a book that someone would read about Jane Austen and they would say, oh my God, this is a really good book about Jane Austen, and not get any of my illusions. And he said it, when he said it at the time, because I was feeling a little more aggressive, I think, than I do now. I'm just too damn weak and too old to feel that aggressive anymore. I felt an element of aggression when he said that. It's like, you know, oh, fuck you, you're not going to get me because I'm so fucking cute. But now I don't hear him saying that anymore. Now I don't hear that. What I hear is like, I want to make myself as available as possible. I want to make myself as available as possible. If everyone doesn't get all my footnotes that are my hidden secret footnotes, that's okay. If this is interesting, you know, the number of messages I get from, you know, from people I would never meet who say, you know, I was really having a hard time getting from horizontal to vertical, so thanks for that. Thanks for helping me get up. I don't think they were necessarily getting my every cutesy little reference to, you know, to Merrill or Stevens or whatever. I don't care. So that's in some sense. I don't care in a good way though. It's like I'm trying to be as welcoming as possible, and trying to hit the right. And this actually touches a little bit, I think, on what Leland was responding to, the right touch of like optimism and pathos, to put it, you know, preciously, or you know, like mourning and you know, whatever, something like that. Yeah.
One more.
Thank you. Go ahead.
I'll say a few words. As I take it, the general argument is that theory has an odd place in relation to public knowledges. So, but you commented on it by beginning with Post, so it's kind of from the perspective of law. So I was wondering whether you could say a little bit more about this thing called legal theory. Because obviously, it was odd that you didn't talk about this entire body of critical legal studies or jurisprudence and so on. And for instance, I remember the initial phase where critical legal studies discovered theory, so to speak. You got articles published like Claire Dalton's A Deconstructed Reading of a Contracts Case, you know, Mark Tushnet's Study of Rights, Duncan Kennedy on sexy dressing, and so on. So could you say a little bit more about whether you see that kind of theoretical reflection as having any kind of efficacy in terms of public legitimation, production of knowledges, and so on?
How to put this very concisely, I would not look to law to see what work you do legitimated in the humanities. I don't think that law schools right now are, I mean, most law students are still English majors. So in that sense, you're farming out, you know, a bunch of what could be future PhDs into law schools instead. But that connection is perfectly, you know, a sympathetic one from the perspective of the skills that are cultivated in one discipline and then are transferred and reformed in some ways in another discipline. But from the perspective of what critical legal studies did and the excitement and enthusiasm that was there, I think, I've described it this way to other people at the conference, but I think a lot of what is happening in law schools, even with very smart people, including Post, who's wonderful and deep, is mid-level political theory and policy. Mm-hmm. So people are not interested in deep questions that don't pose normative reform or don't speak to 5 justices on the Supreme Court in order to persuade them to interpret the Constitution a different way than they previously had. And insofar as theory doesn't cash out in those ways, that's fine. Part of what I was trying to flag by passion is, I think if you did an ordinary language philosophy account of Judith Butler's work, you could get to a kind of moment where one would say, I have a brilliant insight into the way that my doing of gender does not lead me to either be dogmatic or sympathetic necessarily in any given case. That's not given from the fact that you see gender as a doing. And that kind of that kind of thinking that hits a certain moment and is able to reach a very deep and insightful thing about a concept doesn't need to have a programmatic outcome, but law will want it to. And insofar as Martha Nussbaum, as people are very familiar with, famously attacked her for having no legal outcome, I think she spoke in some ways from the vantage point of political philosophy and law, which are still the dominant intersection when it comes to things that would be of mutual interest, texts that would be of mutual interest to a humanities scholar and a legal scholar, because there are many, many intersections from the perspective of the things you read, but from the vantage point of what you want of them, I think the place of desire may be different.
So I'd like to say a few words if I may. And we'll have another reception outside. We can have a drink. So for me, this has really been, of course, a very extremely gratifying, a wonderful event. I'm delighted to see all these former students and to hear about their current interests. Of course, I'm very grateful for the things they have, the complimentary accounts of my work and its importance for them. And even if I don't remember many of the anecdotes that they have told, I've learned from Anne that we get to make up the archive if it's incomplete, so I'm gratified by that. I realize that half of the participants here worked with me as TAs and mostly in the theory course. I still have Eva's very detailed study sheets for the theory course that you produced. In those, I think you did it for 2 years in a row and produced very long accounts of what they should read, what they should think about in order to prepare on each topic. And half of the participants here have collaborated with me in one way or another. Eva for the very short introduction, Avery for the second edition of the very short introduction, and then for the theory of the lyric book that will be out in the spring. Peng, Kevin, and Ben on edited collections of essays. Ben's still to be completed, and as he is discovering, editing a collection of essays is a very thankless task, as you have to pursue, especially if you're pursuing people more senior than you, who hard to harass them to get their essays in. But anyway, so we have worked together in various ways, but as you will have noticed, we don't have here a group of people who are doing the same thing. We have Anne's lesbian history archive. We have Srinivas's amazing Muslim influence on Cenobitic monasticism as part of a comparative political theology. We have Eva's Polish political cinema, etc. Quite a remarkable range of things. And it's generally, I think that's, well, you can say there's no school of color, obviously, and not disciples. And often I feel that I haven't really channeled their interests much at all. When I have tried to get people to do a particular sort of dissertation, I have usually failed. I remember trying to persuade Eva that she really ought to write a dissertation on deconstruction and psychoanalysis, because there was no book on that, and she was, perfectly qualified to write that book. But I lost that battle. Mary Jacobus was either more persuasive or probably more intimidating than I was, and convinced her to write about 19th century women writers. So I lost that battle. I've not been able to, in 37 years, not directed a dissertation on Flaubert. Of course, in that case, I think that I persuade myself that the only possible explanation is that I had already written the definitive book on the topic. So there's no room for a new young person to take that up. But in any case, so the combination of doing theory and working at a place like Cornell with a committee system has meant that I've been able to serve on committees of people doing all sorts of work. There were moments, especially back in the 1980s, when this seemed burdensome. I would be asked to be on committees of people in fields that I knew nothing about, Spanish or Asian studies or anthropology, never philosophy, interestingly, not surprisingly, I guess, but most of the time, of course, it's been students in literature departments. And this has just confirmed me in my sense that I was essentially a dilettante, using theory as an excuse for not knowing much about anything in particular. Certainly when I came to Cornell, I was very much a dilettante in English. My previous jobs had both been in French, teaching really 17th, 19th, and 20th century French literature. My dissertation on structuralism, and even in my graduate studies for the B.Phil in comparative literature, I had focused on three topics, really. Theory on the one hand, and then Renaissance poetry in English, French, and Italian, and then sort of narrative fiction in French and English. So I really came not knowing much about English literature. And there was yet for a while, the standard committee for Cornell modernist was me, Ellis, and Molly Haidt. Molly was more of something of a modernist, but neither Ellis or I was really a modernist. And so a whole generation of Cornell students suffered from this fact, including Kevin, not unless this is Kevin, who's suffered through this non-modernist committee for modernists, as it were. There have been other sort of groups or periods when there seemed to be some kind of consistency. And in the days of Anne and Jeff, it seemed as though I was on lots of committees for people who were arguing the oppression of women in 19th century England has to stop immediately. And they were very politically engaged group. Then now I have a bunch of students who are writing dissertations trying to show that contemporary poetry is actually very politically radical, and even though that may not seem to be the case. We'll see how those turn out. Anyway, when I started compiling a list of former students. Again, I'm starting to invent this archive, trying to figure out whose my records were very incomplete. But I was struck by the variety of projects. So it's not just that was characteristic not only of the people here, but also of others. And just to take the A's, for example, there's of course Srinivas, colonial tropology, 18th century. Colonial and post-colonial studies. Albert Ascoli, who's now holds a chair in Italian at Berkeley, who wrote one of the first committees I was on. He was writing a dissertation on Orlando Furioso. Amanda Anderson, who became director of SCT, so has theory credentials, but was always basically Amanda's view was that post-structuralists ought to grow up and learn how to argue properly like Habermas or something. And now she's trying to encourage us to read Lionel Trilling, that liberalism has gotten a bad name. So Amanda was involved with theory, but in a sort of perverse way. Jim Adams, who's a Victorianist now at Columbia, was here for quite a few years. Bernadette Andrea, who an early modernist who teaches at the University of Texas at San Antonio, and last George Vandenabele, who wrote on 17th century French travel literature and then became a dean of humanities at Santa Cruz and then dean at Northeastern, and now back at Irvine as dean of humanities. So extremely varied crowd. It's certainly been interesting. The flexibility of Cornell has been terrific. Of course, I've not been tied down to any specialty. Once in the days here before Laura Brown, Rick Bogle, and Neil Saccomano, in order to prove to the English department that we did not have to hire an 18th century candidate whom I thought particularly boring, I said, well, of course, we can cover the field without this guy. I can teach, and so I volunteered to teach both the undergraduate survey and a graduate 18th century course. I don't know if any of you folks who are here took that course on theories of language in the 18th century. I found it very interesting, but I guess that those people, who's there? Oh, there's Srinivas. Okay, you were there then. Okay, great. Yes, good. I thought that was very interesting. But then we hired Rick and Laura and Neil, and I don't dabble in the 18th century anymore. But yes, and in general, the department has never seemed to mind much what I taught. So I've been able to do narratology, narrative theory, poetry, Baudelaire and Hopkins. Etc. I've had a very free hand. It's also extremely useful to have two departments. It's that way, if you're annoyed with one, you can say, screw you, as my real loyalty is to the other. So in the bad old days of Wolfgang Holtheim, I could say, of course I'm in Complit because that's where my education was, but really, I hate this, and I'm really in English. when the days of the Radical Caucus in English. I don't know if any of you were here during the Radical Caucus. I could say as soon as I stop being chair, boy, I'm getting out of here and back into Comp Lit. It was anyway. It's very, very good to have these two departments to move between. I've been fortunate in my years here have coincided with great institutional support for the humanities, especially with the series of deans, Don Randall, Phil Lewis, Peter Lepage, all of whom were supportive of the humanities in general and the Society for the Humanities in particular, which has been a great source of stimulation and innovation in general at Cornell. I'm also was lucky in that at the very beginning of my time at Cornell, I had received an unsolicited offer of a chair at the University of Delaware. I had no interest in going there, but I took it into the dean, and they agreed as a result that they would pay for my IBM Selectric typewriter, which was one of my grievances that I had, these things had with a golf ball that flipped. I had to pay. It's as if, now we had to buy our own computers, but it's if I had to pay for my own, but they agreed to that, and they also said that they would promise to give me M.H. Abrams Chair, which turned out to be quite well funded and has been a source of, so I've had plenty of research money through the years to employ some of you in summers, and also which is largely responsible for the possibility of this conference. So I'm grateful for that. I'm very happy to have spent my career here with smart and interesting colleagues from across the disciplines, and much more interaction between disciplines here, between departments here, than I gather usually occurs, and with smart students for which you guys are synecdochically representing here. So I'm sorry not to have been able to bring more of them back, but thank you all for coming and for making this such a memorable event for me.
This has been a production of Cornell University, on the web at cornell.edu.